Hey man, thank you for reading my story. That was really nice feedback. Thank you. Um,
Yeah.
I felt really good about that, but they rejected it, next day. I guess that's how
Yeah.
they do it. They just sort of turn it around very quickly.
Yes, that magazine is known for having very their submission calls are very short. They tend to fill up quickly. So I know that the submission call that you had kind of remixed an old story for was a little bit more technical, and I think those stay open for a little while longer. But if it's a quick, hey, we're going to take the first 150 submissions, they go really fast. A couple minutes they fill up, and they're very good about turning around very quickly.
Wow. So it was lucky that I even got it into consideration then, if that's the
Yes.
case. Huh.
Yes, I've missed some of those calls by minutes, and it's like, some buck. I really, really enjoyed your piece. I thought it was really great. The imagery was beautiful, and that last sentence was a real, like, I was kind of jealous. I was like, man, I got to write more like this.
Well, I mean, thank you, but that was 24 years ago. It was the strange part. It was like looking back in time. I sent you the link to the original story as well. I don't know if you'd had a chance to look at the old one, but I remember reading through the old one, and it had been published in April of '99. And it was the story that I've told that story on this podcast, I think at least a couple of times, where I took really good advice begrudgingly from my thesis advisor, went back to the drawing board, completely rewrote a piece that really had no business being rewritten. I don't know how much of a clairvoyant this guy was to be able to see that kernel of truth in that story and kind of nudge me in the ribs and get me to tell it. But I went ahead and told it the best way that I could when I was 25. And it got published. So the interesting part about revising that story, and that's a pretty cool lead-in. Thank you, Tim. We're talking about revising today. Was going back and reading it. The first thing that I recognized was, wow, yeah, this is really good. I'm proud of myself from back then. But then at the same time, there was this piece of me going, God, you don't need this. Why is this taking so long? There's a lot of this going on. And so I found myself being very critical of my previous self, while also at the same time being very proud of my previous self. Does that ever happen to you? Like when you read stuff that you're revising, how do you approach the work when you kind of step forward to revise something?
I'm always ashamed of what I've written before. I'm always ashamed of what comes after I've rewritten what I had.
Pish posh.
It's funny, as a sort of update, I did find 3 old versions of Patrice and I Take Over the World in the back of the closet with a bunch of other drawings and stuff from grade school and kindergarten and some comic books that I had drawn. And so I'm excited about looking at it. I love looking at stuff that I haven't touched in a month. I'd say a month and longer. You put it on the shelf, you walk away from it, you think about other things, you make the pasta, you take the car to get the oil changed, you have to walk the dog. All of these wonderful things happen to make you completely forget about it and then come back with a fresh set of eyes. And unfortunately, sometimes I get really hooked into a story and lose that objectification. So I'm trying to sort out a way to kind of like organize my stories so that I can have a couple that are on that shelf and marinating, and then me working on something that I'm excited about that's new, so that I can just keep this endless cycle of returning to stuff to give it a fresh look.
I think the right way to do that is to get something published and then not look at it for 24 years. And then you can go back to it and really make hay. That's what I think. What do you think?
Right, because you feel like it's so nice because there's a relief that comes when something gets published. You're like, oh, God, I don't have to think about that anymore. Thank God, And for example, we've talked a little bit about a piece that I reworked. It had been rejected 24 times before it got picked up. And that means I would say roughly there were about maybe 15 to 20 different versions of it because, I'd get a rejection and be like, maybe I need to look at it. Yep, I need to look at it. Let's cut this sentence. Let's add this word and change the title or something like that. And so at the end of that struggle, when that 25th publication and that latest version came to me, and it got picked up, I was like, oh my gosh, thank God that's over. Like, I was so happy and relieved. So yeah, maybe I'll look. Of course, I'll look back at 24 years and go, ugh, how did this get? Ugh.
Yeah, well, maybe. I was looking at it in mind thinking, yeah, I can see how this got published, but then immediately jumping to the things that could be improved. And that, of course, was the challenge. So the particular request that the publishers had made was cut a previously published story by 50% or more. And they're like, yeah, you can anywhere from a sentence to 1,500 words, but that's the max. My story had been 2,800 words, so cutting it in half, 1,400 would be effective. I actually got it to about 13 and change. And I didn't ever feel like I was cutting meaning or cutting relevance or even cutting story. I was really just removing, I guess, what we could call stage direction. There was a lot of, he said, she said, he moved and picked up the glass and, the ice popped him in the nose and like all kinds of stuff that's perfectly fine. And I think for a longer work wouldn't really be an issue. But in a short story, I felt like, wow, if I were giving this person critique now, I would say really well done, but can we pace up this stuff that really doesn't move the emotion along? Because it was doing a good job of sort of moving the characters around the scenery that I had created so that you could track where they're going. No problem. But it wasn't furthering, the point of the story. So by removing it, it actually brought forward more of what was compelling about this relationship. So, once again, I've gone back to the same well and I've found new water. It's crazy. So I think the reason I wanted to talk with you today about revising is that in looking at all the different things that we can do to a story, once it's like done, let's put that in quotes, once the story's done, but you still have to kind of refine it and work on it to get it to where it can be published. There's basically 3 sets of things that you've got to do to it. And they really are separate and distinct. And I think it would be helpful for us to sort of express that as 3 different things that you have to do so that people don't try to do them all at the same time, because you can kind of mess them up if you do them all at the same time. So it's basically revising, editing, and proofing. Revising, if you look at like the literal etymology of revise, it's to see again. And so when you think about revising, you really are changing story elements. You might be changing character names. You might, and actually in the one that I did, I found myself changing tense. So Tim, the original story was in past tense, and for whatever reason, I wasn't consciously aware of it. I didn't go into it with this plan, but in the revision, I changed it from past tense to present tense. Did you notice anything about that, or do you think there was a reason behind it? I have a pet theory, but I'm just curious. Did you notice that when you read it?
I feel like it just makes things much more immediate, and I feel when it comes to shorter pieces, because I really, really love working on shorter pieces, I love reading shorter pieces, you're really trying to make it as present as possible, I think. Obviously, that is, that's not a hard and fast rule, but that's what really made sense to me about your piece that really sang, was that it was happening in sort of like in real time, and I felt more engaged with it watching it happen as opposed to it having been like a recollection. So I enjoyed the fact that it was in first person. I really liked that.
Yeah, thank you. And I stumbled on that by accident, and when I changed the tense, and I'm not even really conscious of why I'm doing it, it created some challenges in retaining some of the phrasing that I had come to be so enamored with over the last, 2.5 decades, because I had certain phrases. In fact, the last line of the story is slightly different from the last line of the one that was published, and that was jarring to me. It's not jarring to anyone else, but it's jarring to me, because it's like if you know the lyrics of a song and you think you know the lyrics of the song for 24 years, and then you listen a little closer and you're like, shoot, that's not what they're saying. They're actually saying this other line. That's the way I experienced it. So I'm like, it doesn't sound right to me, but I think it sounds better. But yeah, it basically created, I think, a little more tension. If you have this first-person narrator telling something from the past tense, it's done, and that psychic distance provides them with a little bit of their own contextualizing. The initial story was about this drunk, who was trying to leave this woman who was dying of cancer. And it was more focused on him and his alcohol use and her disapproval of that, but she didn't have the strength to sort of do anything about it. And he was just kind of clueless. And then it wrapped itself up. So it's almost like they were side by side, kind of ships sailing next to each other rather than in a real relationship. In the revision, it was more about him just trying to leave because he didn't want to watch her die. And so rather than be there for her and be there in a way that was meaningful and would help her at the end, he just wanted to bail. And there was still some alcohol use in there, but it wasn't the point. The point was he was trying to leave, which is why I titled it Leave. Because to me, that is the author telling that guy to get the hell out of her life, because he's no good to begin with. Like, go, leave, please. She'll be better off without you. But he keeps sticking around, and she wants him to stick around. But what's really interesting about the story is that at that pivotal moment when she's basically passed out on the couch, and we kind of look forward into the future and know that she's only got like 6 months left, right?
Yeah.
Like, she's basically at the end of her life. And he's been wanting to leave this whole time. And now all he has to do is stand up and walk out the door because she's on the couch. And he doesn't. And it's worse what he chooses to do, right?
Yes.
And it's like, damn, dude. Like, what? Damn, dude. So, but the way he tells it makes it sound like, I don't know, not a magnanimous gesture, but as this sort of gift. And I'm like, oh my God, it's stomach churning, this guy. Yeah. So, I finally had the courage to tell the story like this and not worry that people will think that that's me, because it's not me. But to get inside of that mind and try to think through what kind of person would approach it this way. And that's all part of revising, is like, what point of view do I want to take? Are these characters working hard enough? Do I need to round out any characters? Stuff like that. What are some tips that you have for people when you're revising? Like, what do you tend to do when you revise?
There are a couple of things that I really like to do. Number one is to rewrite it completely. Like, sometimes we've talked a little bit about my organizational skills as far as like old drafts. I used to love handwriting because I felt like I could see a story progress. But now that I'm much more comfortable with digital, of course, because 20 years have passed, sometimes I feel like I will have versions that get a little too bloated. Like, I'm revising and I'm adding things, but I'm subtracting things. And I can, if I have like a very good paragraph that I feel is really, really great, then I just make a duplicate of the document so that I can cut it out because it's not needed, and maybe save it for some, other, for lack of a better term, remix later. Like, oh, you know what could work in this part? That part that I deleted, 3 drafts ago.
Yeah.
So sometimes that gets a little bit unruly, and I just like to start fresh. It doesn't come scheduled. It's sort of, I'll think of a sentence, or if I'm thinking about the story and an opinion or something happens, I'll like, hey, that's a great way to start that, or that's a place to go towards. I love opening up a fresh document, like putting up a fresh piece of paper and just starting the whole thing over without looking at any former notes. I think we talked once before about Taika Waititi, who once gave the advice that he loves to write a story, puts it on the shelf for a year, then rereads it, and then writes the whole thing from memory, because it cuts out a lot of stuff that obviously wasn't necessary. So I sometimes feel that my revisions get a little bit too much or a little too little, and I love to just start fresh from memory of what I'm trying to accomplish. That, for me, that's for shorter pieces. For longer pieces, that doesn't work out so well, unless I'm really committed to trying to get it done, Yeah. One of the other great things that I love to do in revising is to just find a spot, or just tell your partner, or your dog that you're going to go into the other room and you're just going to read it aloud. When I read pieces aloud, it really, really helps me understand if it's coming off like it's making sense. My favorite way to do that is to actually print the story out so that I can write in real time, cross out a word, fix a spelling mistake, or, oh, this idea just came to me here, I'm going to do that.
Yeah, that's smart. I tend to do everything on the computer. I've told you before, a story has to earn its way onto paper, and it doesn't even get onto white paper until, it's basically done. Maybe that's wrong-headed of me. I'll reconsider that. But I know reading aloud, very important. It's interesting, though, to piggyback on what you just said. I was revising this story, and there was like two different kinds of language. There was, in this particular story, which got only 2,800 words, but there was the stage directions, is what I'm going to call them, where people are basically moving around the set and picking stuff up and saying things. There's a lot of dialogue in that first story. And then there's the more poetic, kind of contemplative, introspective, contextualizing. That's the stuff I really like, and that was the stuff that was actually the strongest in the story. So when I came into the revision, I had this game plan that I was going to try to preserve that and condense everything that was just moving pieces on the board and just try to get straight to that. So I allowed myself to kind of jump into scenes and jump out of them, jump in as late as I could and jump out as quickly as I could, which is good advice for writing screenplays. And that worked really well. What I ended up doing was I too opened up a brand new document. I did it all on my computer, my actual computer, not my Tandy. It would be too difficult to do on the Tandy. So editing on the real computer. Generating brand new stuff, I'll do that on the Tandy. But like editing, you got to do it on the real computer. So yeah, I opened up a fresh blank Word document. And then what I did was I went into the original document, and anything that I thought was keepable, I would just copy and paste into the new document. But I did that with a lot of white space in between, because what I was trying to do is not make it one cohesive narrative, because it wouldn't work that way. And what I recognized was a lot of the poetic elements would work better if I consolidated them. So I ended up kind of rearranging the order of some things and consolidating them. And I thought, well, that'll probably come in like the 2/3, 3/4 mark, but I don't know how. Like, whatever, we'll figure it out. So I just did that. And then an opportunity came out of the plot from the first story, where they have this moment around a record player. And I'm like, oh, yeah, well, the music can just have him jump backward and see all these things at one time, rather than them being kind of interspersed among the different scenes to kind of lose their power. It was almost like breadcrumbs. And I'm like, well, let me just consolidate all of that at the end and see if it has more power. And I think it did. I think it worked pretty well. But yeah, it was just me trying to cut and paste the things that I thought were worthwhile, while also trying to create the connective tissue that would allow you to follow from one scene to the next without all the stage directions and the dialogue. And so I was really happy with the way it came out.
I'm still reading Bono's Surrender, his autobiography, and there are times, especially when they talk about Achtung Baby, the recording, where parts of songs end up, they're like, let's work on this as a song, and then that part of a song kind of gets taken like a melody or a hook or a verse, and kind of, oh, wait a minute, we could put that over here, or we can shift this guitar part and put it in this song because it makes more sense. And that, for me, is one of the things that I like to do as well. Is, you talked about condensing the record scene story, is really trying to distill it down. That's the fun for me, is how little of this dialogue, of this description, of this plot point, how little of that can I get away with to make the point that I need to make? And that's one of the most, that's when I'm really having a lot of fun, is, what's the old Strunk and White? Eliminate unnecessary words, eliminate unnecessary words, eliminate unnecessary words.
That's really the editing portion of the journey. So like the revision, to me, editing and revision are different. So revising, because it's like seeing that story again, you can have that vision multiple times in multiple different ways. You could take different points of view of different characters and kind of write it from different angles until you find the one that makes the most sense for you. This is the version of the story that I want to tell. And so once you've got that story done, now it's time to get down to the editing of it. So you move from revision to editing once the flow of the story, the arc, the characters, all of that is what you want to say. But now you have to go in almost like a sculptor and kind of chisel that thing down to be that perfect version of the story that you want to tell from a language standpoint. So like that's where when I'm looking at, oh gosh, how much dialogue is in the story? Like I've got to remove some of this dialogue because it's not really moving the story along. It's just people talking to each other. And it's not that it's bad dialogue. It's not that it's not realistic, but if it's not advancing the story, they've got to go. It's got to be advancing character. It's got to be advancing conflict. So that's a good thing. And is the phrasing that I have the best way to say something? I don't consider refining language part of the revision process. To me, the revision is, does the story work? Are the characters right? Do we have all of our actions? Like, is all of that good? Yes. Okay, great. Now let's get down to how we're going to express this to the reader and make sure that we're using the right vocabulary, that we are pacing the scene appropriately, things like that. So like, am I lingering on the backstory too much? Sometimes I might be really enamored with like the history of the characters or the setting or the world. And I've seen some books do this where they like talk about a sunset for half a page, or they go into genealogy for 3 pages in a novel and stuff like that. At that point, I do think looking at that critically and saying, is this really helping or is it just stuff, is worthwhile. And I don't think that's part of revision. The revision is, do I have the story right? And the editing is, do I have the language right?
Yeah. And for revising to see if you've got the story right, that's something I always have to check myself on. I love to kind of go headlong into a new idea and start writing it down and things like that. And in revising, in looking over things, that's one of the toughest things that I face personally is, what the hell am I trying to say anyway? What is this story about? And that's always something that I have to step away from the story and think about, like, what's really going on here. And so that really does help in the revision, is to try and narrow down the focus of what is it the moment? Is it the lesson? That's also one of the fun things about revising, but one of my weakest skills.
Yeah. Well, this thing that I just did might be the best revision I've ever done, which I would hope is true because I'm more experienced in life than I've ever been. So that gives me hope. It's also a little frustrating that it's like, wow, it took you until you're almost 50 years old to actually revise something well. Good job. But regardless, I wanted to ask you, think back on all the things that you've written and done and published. Do you have kind of a shining jewel in the hill, this moment where you've done a really good revision that you could tell us about?
The first thing that comes into my mind is a revision that didn't work. Is where
let's do that.
I was, but there was a piece that I sent into a publication, and this is just for a little bit of context. A friend of mine pointed me to submittable.com. He was like, "Oh yeah, it's this website where you can find a lot of publications who are looking for writing work, or photography work, or." So I found a lot of lit mags through that and would do a search for like flash fiction and find lit mags and submit. And so that started happening in earnest, I would say, at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. And so early on, I was sending all of these things out and I wasn't getting any luck, but I mean, that's just how it is. Even having a 300 batting average for submitting and getting published, you're not going to have that. It's far less. I don't think my batting average isn't good as far as that's concerned, but I think that's the sort of norm. But I had a publication that finally said, "Hey, we like this, but we were wondering, we'd like to have a little more sense of," and honestly, I can't remember what they said. "Is there any way that you can fix that for us?" And I just freaked out. I was like, "Oh my gosh, I gotta do this. I don't know when they probably need it back as soon as possible. I gotta figure it out. You know what I'll do? I'll do this." And I wrote a sentence and I changed a thing and I moved my name around and I sent it in and they were like, "Thank you, but we're gonna pass on this piece." So, so it's really revision and editing in things. I tend to put the perspective of the publication at the forefront instead of myself saying, "Is this finished? Is this ready to go?" And there have been, I would say maybe once or twice in the pieces that I've had published where I finished it, I looked at it, I knew the publication that it was going to, and I said, "This feels right." I've got this little itty bitty sparkling little diamond. Let's submit it. And I submitted it and I was accepted. And that feeling doesn't come along very much. The piece that I had rejected 24 times, my revisions of that were driving me nuts. And I tried the tricks that I said earlier. I would read it aloud. I remember one night I got super stoned and tried to rewrite the whole piece. I don't even think any of that edition came back into the final product, but I was trying everything. And then my big moment was I had really, really worked on the last paragraph of this piece. And it was about maybe 75 to 100 words long. And I had a publication that had a submission call that was closing in the next couple hours. And so I remember I was working on it. I looked at it. I reread it. I thought it was finished. I was like, let me just go into I went into the kitchen. I fed Awesome. Awesome's the name of my dog.
Yes.
I came back and I said, you know what? What if I did this? And I cut the last paragraph and I replaced it with like 7 words. I shrugged. I put it in through Submittable to this publication. And they sent a very, very, very nice acceptance letter back. One that made me, I was on my way to the grocery store when I got the email. I was just checking my email on my phone while I was walking to the grocery store. They gave me an acceptance and I stopped walking and I literally stood there and reread the thing like 3 times. Like, how can I be misinterpreting this? This says they're accepting it. It's correct.
Right.
So I wish I had a nice, clear story about, I felt good about this, but not yet. I'm hoping that's something to hopefully strive for when the skies part. Not so much yet.
That's why we're talking, Tim. I mean, I think our experiences are very different. Something that you said had never occurred to me, really never occurred to me, which is that you would write to the specifications or standards or expectations of a particular publication on spec. I mean, obviously, if you work for a publication, you need to conform to their editorial guidelines and kind of write about the things that they expect. But as a freelancer, tailoring your story to a particular publication and saying, I think this will work for them. That's what I'm going to try to do, is give it to them. That's not something I've ever tried to do, to be honest. I'm the other approach, which is, let me just write the best thing that I can. And when I have it done and it's what I want it to be, I'll do some research and see what publications might be a good fit for it. I don't know which one's better. They probably are 6 of one, half dozen of the other, to be honest. And I imagine that my way probably involves more work, more legwork after it's done. Because if you know what you're trying, like what target they want you to hit, then you can write towards that target. It's probably easier. But yeah, I never really considered that. I don't know that I'm going to change, because really writing is such a solitary process. The reason I would even do it is to make me happy. So I kind of don't care what anybody else wants. But at the same time, it would be nice for them to want what I care about. So we'll see if there's ever an intersection there. Yeah.
When I write longer pieces, I feel really I'm trying to tune into my own voice. And with the shorter works, and to clarify just a little more on tailoring for publications, there are lit mags, and I guess you would call them dream mags or dream pubs or whatever you want to call them. I just get some of these publications that I read on a consistent basis. I'm thinking like X-Ray Magazine or Head or any of these other publications. I am so floored by their work. That's why I think what I do is I love looking at a place like Hex Literary and read through their pieces, and I get so inspired and fall so easily in love with the things that are there that I'm like, I would love to try and have that kind of a voice. I would love to try to evoke the kind of emotion that they've done out of me. It's sort of like, wow, I love this band. I'm going to pick up a guitar because I want to sound just like this band. I want to make this music. And then you use that as a base, and then you kind of develop your own style if you follow it for more than 11 guitar lessons like I had in 1990. But so that's one of the things. Like I really love the pieces longer pieces where I really get to like have fun and make up. I love doing science fiction, so I love making up words. I love gobbledygook science. I love foolishness, all of that stuff. But in shorter pieces, I am just so floored by some of the writers that I see that get published that I'm just like, I want to try and do that. And then hopefully from there down the road, incorporate that into my voice. There was a tweet, and I really wish I could remember who it was. I probably have it saved. Someone who said, if your piece isn't finished, don't feel like you have to. If it's not done, don't do it just because there's a submission deadline. Do it when you think is finished. Don't stress out about it. And I agree with that. And I think I more agree with that, that line of thinking than, oh my gosh, I've just found a publication. Now I'm going to try and write like a 17th century Victorian pen pal of, Lord Falquant de Mario or whatever, and change my writing style to fit it. I just love playing around with stuff like that. So, when I find new publications and the authors that they publish are just so like hitting that magic spot inside my head, I'm like, I want to try and write as beautifully as that. Now, that hasn't really ever worked, but it's at least something that's helping me advance my own writing. To me, that's what I hope is helping me.
Yeah, I mean, having the target is really important, right? If you don't have the right target, then you're not going to know what you want to hit. So seeing other people kind of write in a style or a fashion that you find engaging gives you a frame of reference or a targeting point that you can shoot for. And I think that's really clever. Mine was out of touch with reality to begin with. I mean, the kind of stuff that I was writing I almost said as a kid, as a younger man, was, because I was in my 20s, was like based on theater of the absurd and the postmodern, irrealist movement in the 60s. And this was the early 90s at this point. So it was already out of step. And then here I am trying to go back in time and kind of mimic this style because I found it compelling, but the rest of the world had moved on to other stuff. In fact, if you look back, and look, I am no expert at literary movements over time. Zero. But the way that I remember it is that you had this kind of postmodern irrealist in the 60s and 70s, William Gass and all these other people. And then it shifted violently in the 80s, where you had, like Alice Munro, Joyce Carol Oates, Raymond Chandler, even though those folks are pretty different from each other. But they were all based in kind of a hyper-realism. If it didn't really happen, it wouldn't show up in their work. At the same time, you've got Gabriel Garcia Marquez doing magical realism. So I always looked at, look, it doesn't matter what you want to write. There's going to be somebody who wants to read it. It might just be a little harder to find them. And I think I'm just kind of locked into that, Tim. I don't know. I know on the gaming side, that's true. I've designed games that are specifically for me. And when people find it who are like me and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. But those are very few people. It's just not a mass market thing. And they're really good games, but they are for a very specific audience. And my writing might be the same way. Who knows? But I'm going to keep doing it. I mean, I'm finally energized by it. I was telling my wife when I submitted the story, like, I finally submitted something. I remember I sent you a note. I submitted a story. Like, that was a big deal. I hadn't done it in a long time. And the only reason I did it was the external deadline that you had shared with me. Hey, Thursday or whatever it was the deadline. So I appreciate having that external deadline, that ticking clock. I wouldn't have done it otherwise. So I need to find ways to continue to build that into my regular cycle. Not on the origination of new work, but sort of in the getting work that's almost to the finish line. So I got 2 or 3 stories that are basically done, but I need to kind of refine them and get them out the door.
It's such a great feeling for me to hit the submit button. I've got a piece, I feel strongly about it, or maybe sometimes I feel about, 65 to 75% on it, but I've totally submitted things just to cross off a to-do list, to be like, I'm trying to take action. I'm trying to do something with my career. This story is so bad, I don't even know how it ends, but we're going to send it in. And so that feeling of submitting is so wonderful. And it's usually for me so awful in the following moments to go, wait a minute. maybe I shouldn't have ended it that way. Like it's a very short-lived feeling.
Oh, here's the worst, Tim. I submitted that story and I wanted to go back and read it immediately after I submitted it. And I told myself, don't do it. You're going to find something wrong with it. So I didn't. But then I did read it like within maybe a few hours, right? Because I really wanted to just experience it again and just make sure that the way that I thought it came off was the way that it came off now that I've had a little bit of distance. And sure enough, I found a line where I was using dialogue. I was italicizing dialogue, which is not something I really do. That was another departure. I did present tense where it was past before. The one previous had quotation marks. This one I took those out and used just italics. And of course, classic, because I was rushing so quickly, I missed one line of dialogue that should have been italicized. So I'm like, well, that's not going to make, I'm like, you can infer that that's speaking. That alone isn't going to make or break it being published or not. And they did reject it. And they didn't say, well, it's because of that line you didn't italicize. So no, I mean, it wasn't something that scratched their itch. But, that's why I didn't want to read it immediately afterward, because I knew I'd find something wrong with it. And that's the third leg of the stool that we were talking about earlier, is proofing. So we talked about revising, making sure the story gets right. Then we talked about editing, which is making sure the language is right. Then there's all those little ticky-tack, are you consistent within the story? Do you have your name in the right spot? Spelling issues, grammar issues. Are there words that you're not 100% sure what they mean, but you've heard other people say them? Maybe you should look those up, right? And make sure that you're using them correctly. To me, those are three separate things that you really need to take three separate moments in time to do. And I think a lot of times folks will try to combine those to get the story out the door faster. And I want to make the argument that you revise first and you don't worry about the editing or the proofing. Once the story's there, you go ahead and edit it and get the language kind of honed and tight. And then once that's done, come back another time just looking for spacing, grammatical errors, syntax, things of that nature.
Yeah. I think that one of the things I need to do with proofing is to set aside time to give it a final look through. Because we've talked about it before. I've submitted things with some spelling errors. I think one time I got so crazy about submitting to something, had spelled the spell check got me when I was typing out the title in the submission process. So I sent in something that had a misspelling in the title. So yeah, that proofreading is the biggest thing. And again, that's another spot where I think reading it aloud or giving it to someone who can look over it for you really, really helps.
Yeah, I think the reading aloud is definitely a big improvement in the editing phase, because you can hear where the language is clunky or where it takes too long to express something. Or my favorite is when the emphasis is in the wrong part of the sentence. It's kind of like the difference between the man who was sitting at the bar was drinking whiskey versus the man drinking whiskey was at the bar. I mean, those two things express the same idea, but one of them might make more sense in the tone of the story, or the cadence of it. And that's where reading it aloud can be really helpful is, am I getting that emphasis where I want it to be? Sometimes you want a sentence to end with that kind of gut punch or that new information, whereas if you brought that new information at the beginning and then the rest of the sentence were prepositional phrases, then you've shown your hand, but then it still takes time to get to the end of the sentence. So those are editing things for sure, and reading aloud there can help a lot. But yeah, that proofing thing, just coming back to only do that, things that may have escaped me jump out at me.
I love commas. I have loved commas all my life. Vampire Weekend is asking me who gives a fuck about an Oxford comma. I am the one that raises my hand and says, I do, Vampire Weekend. And as a matter of fact, we've been talking about older pieces. I just found, and maybe I should type it up exactly as it is, I just found from high school a one-sentence story I had tried to write. It's 2 pages long, so it's roughly, I'd say maybe it's about I don't know, 500 to 1,000 words. I'm not really sure because I was flipping through looking for the Patrice and I Take Over the World. But it is a sentence that's 2 pages long that I handed in high school. And Mr. DeCamp, who we've talked about before, my favorite teacher of all time, he was like, hey, you need a lot more than commas here to sustain this story. You need some parentheses, you need this, you need that, and you need that. So I have loved commas all my life.
It's funny that you mentioned that you tried to write a story that was one complete sentence. Guess which author has published a story entitled Sentence that does exactly that? Take a guess.
Would it be Arthur Franz IV?
No, sir.
Donald Barthelme?
No, it was Donald Barthelme. Very good guess. Yeah, his story Sentence was, basically playing with that concept, and it was a revelation when I saw it. A lot of my affection for him and the folks who were contemporary with him was that they were very playful in an intellectual way with language, and I found that to be, it filled me with joy to do that. And I was 20 something. I wasn't very good at it, but I sure did try. I had a lot of pluck and gumption, as it were. But what's interesting about kind of growing up that way with that sensibility and now being almost 50 and kind of coming back to writing with renewed energy is that I can take everything I learned without trying to mimic it and apply it to something that is more realistic in its expression, but still has that flavor. It's almost like fat washing, your rum, I have coconut washed this rum, and now it is not only rum, but it is rum with coconuts. So it's like that kind of thing in a literary sense. And I'm hopeful that this new energy and this new focus can yield some results. But yeah, I just keep coming back to the thing you said earlier where you're kind of writing towards specific publications.
It's, we talked about the one sentence story. This might give a little bit more context. I was surprised to find this one sentence story that I wrote back in 1992 because there are at least two that I can think of. There are lit publications out there that are one sentence story publications. You can, you just Google like one sentence story lit magazine and you'll be able to find them. And so it's a way of like finding, oh, wow, I didn't think I could do this, one sentence stories. And so that's kind of what I love doing is finding a lit magazine that has a very specific niche or writers who are fantastic that help me break out of my usual ways of storytelling. Obviously, first and foremost, I'm trying to find my voice, and I feel a little bit more confident with my voice every, 10, 12 years, I guess. I always come back to that, to the idea of Beastie Boys, just taking all of the stuff that you love and making new music with it, or sort of nodding to it, or just straight out sampling it. I love, sampling, I guess, in writing is called plagiarism, so never mind. But I just love being inspired by so many great authors. And when I find a lit magazine that's a little bit different from what I'm doing, I love trying to incorporate that style into my voice. And so it keeps me excited about new projects, so that I don't, I guess this is where I do that Tim thing with the commas now. And I try something different.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, did you get feedback on that piece that you sent to me that you had also sent out to other editors?
No, I've just discovered, it is a 2-week process. So they will, this particular publication says it takes us up to 2 weeks. You'll hear from us within 2 weeks. If not, that's usually a good sign. So now I'm like, okay, we're on day 10. All right. I think I got a shot. I'm going to get rejected. It's going to be a rejection. I'm going to be thinking about it. I'm going to be like, you know what? If I get this publication, oh, goodness gracious, won't I feel? That's usually when I'm like reading my name in the headlines, as the next greatest big writer. That's when I get the rejections. And that's what I'm glad to get, is when I start thinking, hey, I think I've finally, this piece, not a problem. That's going to be accepted. I love getting smacked down.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I was thinking about the success rate. I think you had mentioned it earlier. I don't know that you put a number to it, but I was actually thinking about it last week. What is the true success rate that I've experienced? And I don't know if this is a benchmark or whatnot. I really should look it up to see if there's kind of an expectation. I guess it depends on how good of a writer you are, and also how tapped into the market and how notable your name is. There's a lot of variables that go into it. But for just some schlub like me who's really not in the industry at all and just sort of throwing manuscripts into the wind. I think I had about a 2 to 4% success rate. So when I would send out, and like, for example, the story that I revised that got published back in the 90s, that particular story, I sent it out to 54 publications, and it got picked up by one. Actually, it got picked up by 3, but let me tell the story. So the first one actually just published it. They didn't ask if I could. I sent it to them. They took that as implied, oh, well, we can have this. And then they just printed it. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I found out about it after the fact. In fact, well after the fact. So I was still sort of in the ether, and the publication that took it for real was Cutbank at the University of Montana. So they wrote me back, and they're like, we'd love to publish it. I'm like, yes, please. Thank you. And then much later, like 6 months later, the Paris Review came back to me and said they wanted it. And I had to come clean. I'm like, it was a simultaneous submission. This other publication's already printed it. I'd be more than happy to let you reprint it. And they're like, yeah, okay, whatever. And they had zero interest in that. And I'm like, damn it, I should have held out. But like, should I have? No, there's no way that anybody is ever going to think that the Paris Review is going to pick you up, especially to hold a story for like 9 months at that point on the off chance that, you know, that's my kind of golden goose, right? The Paris Review, I would love to kind of hit that mark. That would be pretty awesome. But again, I'm talking about an older generation of methodology of submitting. You know, like, I don't even really understand how stories get submitted now. I assume everything's through email or web-based, and you just sort of upload a file and that's that. Back in the day, you had to print on paper, you know, your story and shove it in an envelope and put actual stamps on it and throw it in snail mail. Like, this is pre-internet. So, you know, a simultaneous submission was really the only way to do it, and manuscripts would circulate for a couple of months before you really understood where it was going to land. But that was my experience, is that when I sent out 54 versions of this thing, it got picked up 2 or 3 times. But it really only got published twice, and honestly, it really only went to one journal, which is appropriate. It should have only gone to one place. So that's why I say like 2 to 4%. And then I was so greedy for that experience. It really got on a high, like, aha, I'm a real writer, you know. You can fly, you can fly, you can fly, you know. And my next story was not great, but I'm like, I want that feeling again. It was the sort of craving for that sensation. It was very overwhelming, and I'm like, I gotta get something else out. I gotta go. So I kind of got this thing over the finish line and sent it out to, I don't know, maybe 40 places, and crickets. Like, I really didn't get any traction on it because that story was not very good. So it's like, you got to put all the work in up front, make sure it's good, and that you are happy with it. You can put your name on it. You want to show it to other people, and you know that it's not for everybody, but it's for you, and that's fine. And then you start just shopping it around, and I don't know. Is that your experience? I mean, what's your at-bat percentage? Mine's really bad.
Well, I was listening to your discussing about getting into the Paris Review, about your piece from way back when, and now if I can just open it up. So I've looked on Submittable, and again, Submittable is a really nice place. There are other places I think like Duotrope. There are websites where they host a bunch of different places that are taking submissions, and you know, they could be looking for chapbooks, they could be looking for fiction, for creative nonfiction, anything. It's a really cool site that helped me kind of find publications. Another really, really great place, and Art, I think you should take the piece that we've been talking about today that you recently edited, chillsubs.com. Chillsubs.com
Okay.
is a wonderful site that's recently started. And they have a very nice tool there that you know, asks you, what do you have? Do you have a piece of fiction, a piece of creative nonfiction? Do you have photography? What's your word count? What kind of vibes are you going for? I think one of the vibes is not Paris Review, but still pretty good. We're looking for top tier stuff. We're very relaxed. You know, different sorts of levels of seriousness. You know, it's a really great place. And so with Submittable, since I've been looking at that, I just did some math. So my batting average on Submittable is 0.085.
Oh my. Okay.
I have 94. I had 121 submissions, but I had 27 withdraws. So in other words, I've submitted a piece and I've had to withdraw it because it was accepted elsewhere or some other reason. So I have 94 pieces and 94 submissions, 8 accepted on submittable alone. It can be misleading. Are you going to get more rejections than acceptances? Yes. And if you have more acceptances than rejections, well, you're probably not even listening to this podcast. But I mean,
they're not listening.
They're not listening. But there are always going to be more rejections than acceptances. And the feeling that you talked about, I love that. I love feeling like I don't have to write for the day. For example, if I get an acceptance, I'm like, hey, I can give myself a break. I don't need to feel the endless stress of having to have finished products and publications. I've got one. I give myself the day off. And also, in speaking of that, in your final going through of your piece, if you're rereading it for the last time to make sure it's ready for submission, it does end up having to be your voice in the end. And I think that there are pieces that have been rejected where I've reread the rejected piece and gone, you know what? It wasn't confident. It wasn't confidently me sending that piece out. And that smells like stale sweat.
Yeah. Well, that's well said. So you have 8 accepted out of 94 submitted, right?
Yes.
Okay. So that's 8.5%. So that's pretty good. I'm certainly compared to the 2 to 4% that I was talking about. So that's great. I think we can comfortably say that non-professional writers who don't have relationships with editors, who just sort of throw manuscripts into the ether, less than 10% success. Let's just say that. For anyone out there who is sort of submitting them onesie-twosie and being crestfallen about them not being taken, it is a numbers game. I remember being in school with people who I felt weren't super skilled. But man, they were persistent. They wrote every day. They revised all the time. And even though it wasn't my taste, but man, they were diligent and they were after it and they were sending stuff out all the time. And those are the people who get published. So equating publication exclusively with merit is not appropriate. It's not the way it works. So I know why I haven't gotten published very much. I stopped writing for 2 decades plus, and I haven't submitted anything in God knows how long until this past week, which is why I went to my wife and I kind of did a little fist pump, and I'm like, baby, I got my first rejection letter. I'm back in the game, and we had a good laugh about it.
Yeah. And that's, it is a numbers game. The thing is just reading the publications to see if it's a fit for you, because Chill Subs will give you, I was really upset. I think it was my first HAD submission that I had was at the beginning of last year, the magazine that you just submitted to. I was very, very excited about it. I thought I wrote something very good. I was really, really excited, and it didn't make it. And it got a rejection. And I was so disappointed and so kind of frustrated at it that I immediately went to Chill Subs, found a magazine that was fitting the parameters, like it was the length, it was what they were looking for. And I sent it in just on a lark, and I got an acceptance like in 2 days' time. Nice. I was like, what the shit just happened there? So, I mean, that's never going to happen again, but it's a really, really wonderful website. They do some good work on it. It's brand new, and it's a really, really great way to do it. And besides submittable, sometimes you have to pay to submit to some magazines, like $3 or $5 here, or some place just hit me up because they've rejected 2 of my pieces, and they were like, hi, we need submissions. Could you please send us submissions? We need to support the work that we're doing. So I just sent them like $5 to submit and $6 for an expedited response time. So Chill Subs will tell you if it's a paid publication or if you have to pay to submit. Submittable usually ends up having magazines that do have to pay because they have to pay the fees for submittable.
Yeah, sure. That makes sense. I mean, it's such a small amount. It's almost like crowdsourcing at that point.
One of the things that I learned a long time ago from Bruce Jordan. Bruce Jordan is the guy who created the show Sheer Madness, which is, been all over the place. And I've done like 12 productions of it in my time. But Bruce Jordan was always, of the mindset that, look, if you just show up to the audition, that's twice as much work as so many other people. You just have to show up. So I'm not telling you that you should just, take any old nasty thing that you have and put it out there to try and get published. But the simple fact that you're submitting something is so much more than the majority of people that are living on this planet. You have just put something into the culture. And that's something that's to be applauded. Even if you're doing it once a month, even if you're doing it once a year, it's still more than other people. So you're showing up. So yeah, I can't wait to see you submit more stuff, because that piece that you sent me the other day, Art, that I read is going to get published, and it's going to get published soon.
That's really kind of you. Thank you. I think it's pretty good. It certainly says what I want it to say, which is an accomplishment in and of itself. And I didn't even know that it was going to happen that way. We'll see.
Yeah.